Now this is one of the best, strongest, fastest Charged Bolt build for the Sorcerer in Season 3. With this build you can easily clear multiple tier 100 nightmare dungeons and destroy bosses. With this build I do focus on defense, survivability, and maxing out my resistance. And this build is so strong that you should have your ultimate skill, Unstable Currents, active almost all the time. So let's check this out. So first I'm going to show you clearing this dungeon. And as you can see, this is a tier 100 nightmare dungeon. This build can also easily clear tier 100 Bolt nightmare dungeons as well. This build is so strong that you'll easily clear huge groups of enemies and shred bosses. This is also a very good leveling build once you reach world tier 4. Now when leveling, you don't need any unique items for this build to work. But there is one unique item that will make the leveling process a lot easier and faster. The one unique item is the Staff of Lamasen. And this unique item is easily farmable. But just be aware when leveling, this item is not really needed. Now the way to get your ultimate skill Unstable Currents active almost all the time is that you need the unique boots, the Flicker Step boots, because when you evade through enemies with the Flicker Step boots, you will greatly reduce your ultimate skills cooldown. And I'll also go over some other alternate gear that you can use if you are missing some unique items, but I'll go over everything in more details in their dedicated sections. And I'll have the full build layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. Okay, so starting with the skills. Now our main skill is Charged Bolts, and this skill does tons of damage. It'll destroy huge groups of enemies and shred bosses. The next skill I'm using is Frost Nova, and this is a good defensive skill because it will freeze and apply vulnerable to enemies, and on bosses it will greatly increase their stagger bar. The next skill I'm using is Lightning Spear, and this is also a good defensive skill because it will stun all the enemies around you, and it will also apply vulnerable to them. And this skill is also good at staggering bosses. The next skill I'm using is Ice Armor, and this is a really good barrier skill for defense and survivability. And next, the ultimate skill I'm using is Unstable Currents, and this skill will do tons of damage and destroy groups of enemies and melt bosses. And with the unique boots, the Flicker Step boots, you can have your ultimate skill active almost all the time. And the last skill I'm using is Teleport, and this is the best and fastest movement skill in the game. Okay, so next for the enchantments. Now the first enchantment I'm using is the Firebolt enchantment, and this will allow your skills to apply burning damage to enemies. And doing burning damage to the enemies will pair with other passive skills on our skill tree, and also pair with some rare nodes on our Paragon board. The next enchantment I'm using is the Chain Lightning enchantment, and this will allow you to form Chain Lightnings after spending 100 mana. And since we're spamming Charged Bolts all the time, Chain Lightnings will fly everywhere. And this pairs with the legendary node Static Surge on the Paragon board, which will allow the Chain Lightning to apply vulnerable to enemies and regenerate some mana. And Chain Lightning will also help proc our lucky hit chance. Okay, so next for the Seneschal Construct. And I do want to mention that the Construct actually makes this build stronger because it will help apply vulnerable to enemies and also increase your damage. So the first Governing Stone I'm using is Lightning Bolt, and this will launch a bolt of lightning to an enemy. And I paired it with the Tuning Stone Multi-Shot Support, and this will allow the Construct to shoot additional projectiles. The next Tuning Stone I paired it with is Piercing Support, and this will allow your lightning bolts to pierce through enemies. And the last Tuning Stone I paired it with is Breaking Support, and this will apply vulnerable to enemies. The next Governing Stone I used is Flash of Adrenaline, and this will greatly increase your damage. And the Tuning Stones I paired it with is Tactical Support, which will decrease its cooldown. And the next Tuning Stone I paired it with is Duration Support, and this will increase the skill's duration. And the last Tuning Stone I paired it with is Safeguard Support, and this is good for defense and survivability because it will grant you damage reduction. Okay, so next let's check out the skill tree. And I do want to mention that depending on your situation, either if you need more damage or defense, then you can switch some skill points around. But this is the skill tree layout I use to easily clear tier 100 nightmare dungeons. So starting with the basic skills, I put 1 point into Firebolt and 1 point into Enhanced Firebolt, and this is just used for the Firebolt enchantment. Next for the core skills, I put 5 points into Charged Bolts, a point into Enhanced Charged Bolts, and a point into Greater Charged Bolts. And this is our main damage dealing skill. It will destroy huge groups of enemies and bosses. Next I put 1 point into Chain Lightning, and this is just for the Chain Lightning enchantment. And Chain Lightning will pair with the legendary node Static Surge on the Paragon board, and will also help proc our lucky hit chance. Next I put 1 point into Devastation and 3 points into Elemental Dominance, and this will increase our core skills damage. Next for the defensive skills, I put 1 point into Teleport, a point into Enhanced Teleport, and a point into Shimmering Teleport, and this is just the best and fastest movement skill in the game. Next I put 1 point into Ice Armor, a point into Enhanced Ice Armor, and a point into Shimmering Ice Armor, and this is a barrier skill which is good for defense and survivability. Next I put 1 point into Frost Nova, a point into Enhanced Frost Nova, and a point into Mystical Frost Nova, and this is a good defensive skill because it will freeze all the enemies around you and also apply vulnerable to them. And if you Frost Nova a boss, it will greatly increase their stagger bar. Next I put 1 point into Elemental Entombment, and this will give you a chance to reset the cooldown of one of your defensive skills. And then I put 3 points into Glass Cannon, and this will greatly increase your damage, but in return you'll take more damage. Next for the Conjuration skills, I put 1 point into Lightning Spear, a point into Enhanced Lightning Spear, and a point into Invoke Lightning Spear, and this is a good defensive skill because it will stun all the enemies around you, and it will also also apply vulnerable to enemies. And if you use this skill on a boss, it will increase their stagger bar. Next, I put 3 points into Conjuration Mastery, and this will increase your damage for each active conjuration. Next, I put 3 points into Precision Magic, and this will greatly increase your lucky hit chance. And lucky hit chance is important for this build. Next, I put 1 point into Align the Elements, 1 point into Mana Shield, and 1 point into Protection. And these skills are really good for defense and survivability. Next, for the mastery skills, I put 1 point into Inner Flames and 3 points into Devouring Blaze. And this skill will greatly increase your critical strike damage against burning enemies. And this is one reason we're using the Firebolt enchantment. Next, for the ultimate skills, I put 1 point into Unstable Currents and a point into Prime Unstable Currents. And this skill will destroy huge groups of enemies and melt bosses. And if you pair this ultimate skill with the unique boots, the Flicker Step boots, you can have this ultimate skill active almost all the time. Next, I put 1 point into Coursing Currents and 3 points into Electrocution. And this skill is really good for defense and survivability because enemies will deal less damage. And next, I put 3 points into Convulsions. And this states Lucky Hit. Shock skills have up to 9% chance to stun enemies for 3 seconds. And since we're building some lucky hit chance, this will allow your shock skills to stun enemies. And next, I put 1 point into Permafrost, 1 point into Hoarfrost, and 3 points into Frigid Breeze. And this states Lucky Hit. Cold damage against vulnerable enemies has up to a 20% chance to generate 15 mana. Now, if you didn't know, this skill was bugged in Season 2, and it looks like it's still bugged in Season 3. This skill is bugged because this skill also works with lightning damage and fire damage, so this skill will work with all our lightning skills, and you will regenerate your mana really quickly. And last but not least, for the key passive, I put a point into Virus Mastery, and this will greatly increase your shock skills damage to close enemies, and you also take less damage from close enemies. Okay, so that's pretty much the full skill tree layout for this build to easily clear tier 100 Nightmare dungeons. But like I mentioned before, if you need more damage or if you need more defense and survivability, then there are some skill points that you can change around. Okay, so next let's check out the gear. But I do want to mention that this is an endgame build to easily clear tier 100 Nightmare dungeons. So if you're still leveling to 100, then you can use similar gear, and I'll share some other gears that you can use. The only piece of gear that you want, but it is not really needed when leveling, is a unique item, the Staff of Lamasen. This unique staff is easily farmable and is farmed by beating Gregor at the Hall of Penitent. But I'll go over everything in details when going over the items. Now I'm just going to go over the important stats and legendary aspects for each piece of gear, but I'll have the full build layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. So first, checking out the helmet. The stat you're looking for is total armor and cooldown reduction. And the legendary aspect I have is that Virus Mastery key passive also grants 8.7 damage reduction for each close enemy, up to 26.1%. Now on the chest armor, you're looking for total armor and 3 damage reduction stats. And the legendary aspect I have is that you take 25% less damage from crowd control or vulnerable enemies. Next, for the gloves, you're looking for attack speed, lucky hit chance, lucky hit, up to 5% chance to restore 15% primary resource, and ranks to Charged Bolts. And the legendary aspect I have is that Charged Bolts pierce, but deal 40% less damage to targets hit after the first. And this legendary aspect is important for your Charged Bolts to destroy huge groups of enemies. Next, for the pants, the stat you're looking for is total armor and 3 damage reduction stats. And the legendary aspect I have is that you gain 1.1% increased armor for 4 seconds when you deal any form of damage, stacking up to 66%. Next, for the boots, I'm using the Flicker Step unique boots. And for these boots, you're looking for high movement speed and high damage reduction stats. And the unique aspect is that each enemy you evade through reduces your active ultimate cooldown by 3.6 seconds, up to 10 seconds. And these unique boots are important if you want to have your ultimate skill Unstable Currents active almost all the time. Just make sure you are evading through enemies so you can benefit from the unique aspect. Next, for the weapon, I'm using a two-handed unique staff, the Staff of Lamasen. And with the staff, you're looking for high damage stats. And the unique aspect is that your cast of Charged Bolts have a 60% chance to be attracted to enemies and last 300% longer. Now, this unique aspect is really good for damaging enemies far away and for leveling. This unique aspect is really good because it will auto aim your Charged Bolts to enemies. So you can just run around and aim anywhere, and your Charged Bolts will damage all the enemies in the area. So you don't have to focus on aiming, and you can speed through the dungeons, making this unique staff really good for leveling as well. Now, this unique staff is easily farmable by beating Gregor at the Hall of Penitent. And to summon Gregor, you just need to get the summoning material, Living Steel, that you can easily gather by doing Hell Tides. Okay, so next, for the amulet, you're looking for movement speed, mana cost reduction, and cooldown reduction. And the legendary aspect I have is that you deal 51% more damage to immobilized, stunned, or frozen enemies. And because this build has tons of crowd control, this legendary aspect will greatly increase your damage. Now, next, for the rings. Now, the first ring I'm using is the Taurasha's unique ring, and you're looking for high resource regeneration stats and high cooldown reduction stats. And the unique aspect is that for each type of elemental damage you deal, gain 15% increased damage for 4 seconds. Dealing elemental damage refreshes all bonuses. So this unique aspect aspect will greatly increase our damage. And the second ring you're looking for is the blue rose unique ring. And you're looking for a high lucky hit chance and high mana cost reduction stats. And the unique aspect states lucky hit. Damaging an enemy has up to a 30% chance to form an exploding ice spike, dealing 1724 cold damage. Triple this chance if the enemy is frozen. Now this unique aspect allows us to do cold damage, and when you pair it with the Talrasha's unique ring, it will greatly increase your damage. So that's pretty much the gear and legendary aspects you're looking for this build to easily clear tier 100 nightmare dungeons. But I'll go over some other pieces of gear if you're missing some of the unique gears. So first with the weapon, if you can't find the staff of La'Misen, you can basically use any other weapon. So you can use a wand in the offhand or another two-handed staff. Just make sure the weapon has a high item power level because that'll greatly increase your damage and has really good stats. So the stats you're looking for are like all stats, intelligence, and or like critical strike damage. And on the wand, the legendary aspect I have is that critical strikes with core skills increase your attack speed by 25% for 5 seconds. And if you're using an offhand, you also want high item power level. And for the stats, you're looking for like mana cost reduction and resource regeneration. And the legendary aspect I have is that you deal 30% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while you have a barrier. But when it comes to the weapon, ideally you want to use this unique staff, the staff of La'Misen. Next for the boots, if you can't find the flicker step boots, which is farmed by beating Daryl, you can use Esu's heirloom, which is really good to increase your critical strike chance, or you can use some legendary boots like this. And the stats you're looking for is movement speed, ranks to teleport, and ranks to frost nova. And the legendary aspect I have is that you gain 20% movement speed, lose this bonus for 2.5 seconds after taking damage. And next for the rings. Now if you can't find the Talrasha's unique ring or the blue rose unique ring, then you can use a legendary ring like this. And the stats you're looking for is critical strike chance, maximum mana, and resource regeneration. And the legendary aspect I have is that you deal 30% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while you have a barrier. Okay, so that's pretty much the alternate pieces of gear that you can use for this build if you don't have the unique gears. So when you're leveling, you don't have to have the best equipment because this build is so strong that you can easily destroy enemies that are 10 levels higher than yourself. But when you're ready to push the highest tier nightmare dungeons, then ideally this is the best gear and legendary aspects you're looking for. Okay, so next really quickly for the gems. Now for the armor pieces, you're looking for ruby gems to increase your maximum life. Now on your weapon, you're looking for emerald gems, and this will increase your critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies. Now on your jewelry, first you want to max out your resistance, and then once you max them out, then you can put skull gems. So I have one skull gem on my amulet, one emerald gem on my ring to get poison resistance, and one amnest gem on my other ring for shadow resistance. And as you can see, pulling up my resistance, all my resistance is capped out. Okay, so next let's check out the Paragon board. And I do want to mention that with this Paragon board, I did focus on defense, survivability, and capping out my resistance. And I did take 7 glyphs to maximize my damage. Now I'm just going to quickly go over the Paragon board and the glyphs, but I'll have the full Paragon board layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. So starting with the starter board, I took the Elementalist glyph, and this will greatly increase your damage when you deal fire, cold, or lightning damage. And you're going to deal fire damage from the Firebolt enchantment, and you're going to do cold damage with the blue rose unique ring. The second Paragon board I took is the Static Surge Paragon board, and the glyph I'm using is Destruction, and this will greatly increase your critical strike damage. I also took the legendary node Static Surge, and this states after spending 64 mana, your next cast of Chain Lightning or Charged Bolts makes enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds and restores 10% of your mana. Now we're using both of these skills, so Charged Bolts is our main damage skill, and we're getting Chain Lightning from the Chain Lightning enchantment and the ultimate skill Unstable Currents. Then I headed this way, and the next Paragon board I took is Burning Instinct, and the glyph I took is Tactician, and this will greatly increase your damage after casting a defensive skill. And I highly recommend to take these magic nodes and this rare node Safeguard to greatly increase your defense and survivability. Then I headed down this way, and the next Paragon board I took is Enchantment Master, and the glyph I'm using is Territorial, and with this glyph you will gain 15% damage reduction against close enemies, which is really good for defense and survivability. Then I headed this way, and the next Paragon board I took is Ceaseless Conduit, and the glyph I'm using is Control, and this will greatly increase your damage to stunned or frozen enemies. Then I headed up this way, and the next Paragon board I took is Frigid Fate, and the glyph I'm using is Exploit, and this will greatly increase your damage to vulnerable enemies. I also took the legendary node Frigid Fate, which states you deal bonus damage to vulnerable enemies equal to 10% of the total amount of bonus damage with cold, up to a maximum of 30%. Current bonus 11%. Now this legendary node is really good even if we're not building cold damage, because as you can see with the current bonus, we're still getting an 11% damage multiplier even without building any cold damage. Then I headed this way, and the last Paragon board I took is Searing Heat, and the glyph I'm using is Flame Feeder, and this will greatly increase your damage to burning enemies. And this is is another reason we took the Firebolt enchantment, so we can get the burning damage. Okay, so that's pretty much the full Paragon Board layout for this build. But I do want to mention that for your glyphs, if you're trying to get the bigger radius, then your glyph level has to be level 15 or higher, because without the bigger radius, you might not be able to get the additional bonus. So that being said, on your glyphs, make sure you check the requirements to get the additional bonus. And like I mentioned before, I'll have the full Paragon Board layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. Okay, so thanks for checking out one of the best, strongest, fastest Charged Bolt build for the Sorcerer in Season 3. With this build, you can easily clear multiple Tier 100 Nightmare dungeons and melt bosses. Now, I plan to do a hybrid build with Meteor and Charged Bolt, so stay tuned. And if you need a strong and fast leveling build for the Sorcerer, then definitely check out this video here. Hope this helps in more Diablo 4 videos to come, and of course,